On behalf of the Statistical Society of Australia, I would like to welcome you all to this webinar, which is a collaboration between the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Statistical Society. My name is Sabine Braat and I'm the co-chair of the Society's Biostatistics and Bioinformatics section. So during the next hour, we will learn more on how to unlock the full potential of multiple cause mortality data. But before we start, I have some practical announcements. So the webinar will consist of 2 presentations and will last an hour. We will allow time for questions, but after the end of both presentations. So therefore, I would like to ask to please save your questions until the very end of the webinar. But if you have a question during the presentation, you can use the chat log, which you can find at the bottom, and we will address the question at the end of the presentations. So as I said, the webinar consists of 2 presentations, and we will start the webinar with a presentation from Eynstone-Hinkins and Moran from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So James is the Director of Health and Vital Statistics at the ABS, where he is responsible for the births, deaths, marriages, divorces and causes of death datasets. He has overseen a large program of work aimed at maximizing the utility of the national mortality dataset, including improvements to timeliness and quality of underlying data. He works closely with the international statistical community on coding and classification issues, and for the past 3 years has been a member of the World Health Organization's ICD-11 task force. And Lauren Moran is the Assistant Director of the Health and Vital Statistics section, where she heads the cause of death team. And Lauren has expertise in death certification and cause of death coding and analytics. She has led the delivery of large-scale projects which enhance the use and value of health and population data, including better use of multiple cause data for external causes of death. So that will be our first 2 presenters, and following that, we will have a second presentation, which will be provided by Dr. Margarita Moreno-Betancur. And Margarita is an ARC DECRA Fellow and Team Leader Senior Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne and the Murdoch Children Research Institute. And since her PhD in biostatistics, which she completed in France, she leads the research developing statistical methods motivated by analytical challenges arising in health and medical research studies, which focus on the areas of causal inference, missing data, and survival analysis. And this research is fueled by various collaborative projects, particularly in life course and social epidemiology. She has a leadership role in the renowned Victorian Centre of Biostatistics and the Murdoch Children Research Institute Life Course Initiative, comprised of over 40 longitudinal cohort studies. So that was the introduction of the speakers, and I would like to now give the floor to James and Lauren. So please feel free to start the presentation whenever you're ready. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sabine, and I will start. Just want to say for both myself and Lauren, this is our first webinar, so please bear with us. Hopefully everything will go according to plan. But today we do want to talk about the national mortality data set and focus in on multiple causes of death. I think to be able to do that successfully, what we'd really like to do is just talk a little bit in the first place about the mortality data set and the history of that and how it has tracked changes in patterns of mortality over time. And then really we'd like to give you a bit of a coding 101. So how do we put the national mortality data set together? It's really important information to understand how this complex data set comes together and what the implications are for both how it's used now and into the future. Obviously, we'd like to talk a bit about the benefits and limitations of using underlying cause of death. So this is the concept of a single cause of death and where the limits of that are, how we currently use multiple cause data, how we are looking to change data into the future, and certainly how we're looking at enhancing the national mortality data set. So we'll cover quite a lot of ground and hopefully do that quite quickly for everybody. So the evolution of mortality data. On the left-hand side of the slide here, you will see something from the Bills of Mortality. This one is from 1664. Back when people were realizing that it is really important to start understanding what people are dying from. Obviously, medical knowledge back then was quite different, and you might see some things that look a little humorous, perhaps even in terms of today's medical knowledge, but this was people simply trying to understand what people were dying from in some sort of structured way. And perhaps if you're looking for a reason why they were doing that, the mention at the bottom of that bill of mortality there of plague, luckily a 0 against that there, but obviously was causing a lot of deaths back around that time. On the right-hand side, you can see a version of an Australian vital statistics report, where we're beginning to see the introduction of the International Classification of Diseases. And in fact, it isn't that different to what we currently use to compile mortality data. There's 2 chapters there from the nervous system and the circulatory system. And obviously this is a way of now trying to bring together knowledge about what people have died from into meaningful lists that are useful from an understanding, analysis and policy perspective. I think if we look over the last 100 years, there's one thing in certainly the 20th century that would define mortality data, and that is the death rate from heart disease. And of course, in the early part of the 20th century, there was a very rapid increase in heart disease mortality. Between 1940 and 1968, you can see a very, very rapid decline, and subsequently after that, quite a decrease. And of course, this is where mortality data has been so incredibly useful to recognize that there was the starting of an epidemic, the ability for the international community to start working on ways to try and understand that, to recognize what the risk factors were, and to progressively start thinking about what could be done about those things. And over a period of time from 1968 through to the present day, we have seen an enormous decrease in heart disease mortality, not from one particular intervention, but from progressive rollout of many, many interventions. And in fact, the significance of that is that we have approximately a 90% reduction in heart disease mortality in a 50-year period. This is more of our contemporary how we release information, the basic tabulation of cause of death data. This is from our most recent publication from the ABS. You can see very easily that now we're working with leading cause groupings. So we'll talk a bit about underlying causes of death. Those are the individual diseases or conditions. Leading causes is groupings of those diseases or conditions to make meaningful groupings from a public health perspective. Of course, our leading causes of death in Australia are heart disease, dementia, cerebrovascular diseases or strokes, lung cancer, and chronic lower respiratory diseases. Between 2009 and 2018, those have remained our leading causes of death. But if we take a look at that from a graphical perspective, you can see again that very big decrease even in the past 10 years in heart disease mortality. And the green line that is there shows us that in fact it's dementia, including Alzheimer's disease, which is on the increase among our leading causes of death. If we were to project that graph not too far into the future, we can see that we are likely to have a change in our leading cause of death quite soon. And in fact, for females in Australia, dementia is already the leading cause of death. And that's a really significant change from a very, very long time as heart disease being leading cause. So how do we put this data together? And what are all the implications from a multiple cause perspective? I'm going to hand over to Lauren, who is going to explain all of that.
Thanks, James. I'll just get my screen up. Okay, there we go. So I thought we would just backtrack a little bit and talk about the death certification process within Australia. So deaths have 2 streams in the Australian environment. So the majority of them are certified by a doctor using the medical certificate of cause of death, and we also have a coronial stream. So that death certificate comes through to the ABS from the Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages, and we have a coding team who applies ICD-10 codes. We do some coding around the demographics, and we have a look at the legitimacy of the sequence of events as the doctor tells us. So to give a bit more context to that, here's an example of a death certificate, and this is an international best practice ones, but the Australian ones are very, very similar. So we asked them for some demographics, which is obviously important for finding mortality patterns, and some contextual information around perioperative deaths and things like that. But I'll draw your attention to the cause of death text box. So there's two parts of the death certificate, and what we're asking the doctor to put into part one is their best medical opinion of circumstances leading directly to death. So we're asking for a terminal complication, so something we may see there is multi-organ failure or septic shock or some type of hemorrhage from an injury. We're asking for those intermediate causes such as a chronic kidney condition, and we're asking for a diagnosis that started that chain of events. So maybe ischemic heart disease, diabetes, cancer is something really commonly that's put into that box. Then we also have this part two section down here, and that's where we're asking them for things that contributed to the death but weren't directly involved. So that could be other chronic health conditions which have just weakened their immune systems, or it could be a mental health condition that affected somebody's ability to contact health services. So all different types of things, that's all put in and sent to the ABS for analysis, and where we put those ICD-10 codes. And I will just quickly mention that the coroner referred deaths have quite a different look for multiple causes and the way we apply ICD-10 codes. So all coroner referred deaths, although they do have a coronial note which is similar to that medical certificate, have data that's available on the NCIS. So that's a police form, an autopsy, toxicology and a coronial finding. So our team is able to go through and read the narrative and compile some events around that that are quite important to the death. So a few things that are different is nearly all of our external causes of death in Australia must go to the coroner as set by legislation. So we have some injuries that go there also with mechanism and intent, and the multiple causes can sometimes differ. So a multiple cause may relate more to the intent. So some of those mental health conditions are related to the decision for death as opposed to the actual injury outcome, and some of them are about exacerbating the injury. So the World Health Organization then has this thing that's called the underlying cause of death. So and when we're saying, do we die from one cause, we're really focusing on that. So the underlying cause as defined by them is the event that initiated that train of events leading to death, or the thing that's caused the fatal injury. And the World Health Organization formulates all of these. There's a big team of people who work on it, and it has a real public health idea that this is where the intervention point for death could have been prevented. So it's often a starting point in disease process, an intervention point. It could be the external incident, and sometimes it's this linkage of conditions. So once it gets to us and we're talking about these multiple causes, this is what our coding software looks like. So we can see on this death certificate that the doctor has filled it out quite nicely. They've said that that thing that started the chain in disease process is chronic hepatitis C, and then this has led to some intermediate conditions such as cirrhosis and sepsis, and we've got the terminal condition there of the vomiting of blood. So then we've put ICD-10 codes against all of these. Now, if we were just picking the one cause, so the underlying cause, you can see in the blue box, this is what we're saying, that it's the hepatitis, and that's what would go into our leading cause groupings. But if you see the green box here, we actually do keep all of those multiple cause codes. So they're stored in our database. And if people were more interested in liver conditions, which resulted in cirrhosis, then this would be important to have that there. So they do have value, and they can be underused if just left sitting there. And so this is just to show that sometimes it's more about an intervention point. So this is a really common death where we may have pneumonia, a heart attack and heart disease. And it's actually the heart attack that would go as the underlying cause, because the coding rules were developed in a way that's saying that heart attacks are a very common intervention, and it's important for public health policy to know those. Once again, in the green box, we're retaining all those codes. And I just wanted to give an example also of external causes, because they are stored and coded in quite a different way. So this type of death would be coded from the National Coronial Information System. So we would have gotten through that it had been a drug overdose. We can see it's intentional. It has opioids in it. There's also benzodiazepines in there. So we code all of that in, as well as the intent of death. yet we keep that X64, which is a multiple drug overdose in ICD-10 terms, as the underlying cause. So although it could be argued that the depression and anxiety contributed to the decision to end one's life, it's really important from that underlying cause perspective that the suicide count is representative. So we don't want them to be in different places. We need to be able to easily enumerate them, but we are retaining all of that information. And then there are some more sophisticated codes, but these can be limited where we start to link conditions. So this is a nice example where somebody has type 2 diabetes, then they have chronic kidney disease, and for the final outcome we have this E112, and that means diabetes with kidney complications. But there's not so many of those codes, there's a few different ones. So there are some benefits to having this one underlying cause. So the ICD is an international construct, and it does allow these internationally comparable data sets, and it can be really helpful in low resource settings. And sometimes it is nice just to be able to pull out some simple messaging from the mortality data that we can just put out there and say, hey, these are important from a public health perspective. And we also have asked the doctor to give us their best medical opinion, and the underlying cause is designed to best represent that. And there are those few combination codes, but they are few and far between. However, there really are some major limitations. We know that we saw all of those other codes that we're forgetting about and that have really important context in terms of the death. As people live longer, they're more likely to have chronic conditions. And so the relative importance of these and thinking of them as those clusters and combinations can definitely be missed, and that important focus not there. And of course, public health intervention points are likely to be in multiple spots. It's never just about one area, and that underlying cause construct doesn't really service that at all. And it is just a group of people at the WHO, and although they're very expert, they're trying to put a classification that's internationally relevant. So there are emphasis on some conditions that don't always mean that they're going to be the right thing for a country context. So there's definitely some bias in that as well. So we know we've got the multiple cause data, so how can we better use it? What are some of the opportunities? So we know that every death certificate has on average 3 to 4 conditions in Australia, and we know that we're an ageing population, so we would expect more conditions to be on death certificates. So you can see here that as people grow older, they're likely to have more conditions on the death certificate. So once people are aged over 80, over 80% of death certificates have multiple conditions written on them. And for the child deaths in that 0 to 4 age group, it's sitting at just over 60%. So still high, but it's a bit lower than the others. But before we can just go in and start pulling them out and using them, there needs to be some really careful consideration. So we spoke about that terminal cause, the intermediate cause, and that line D and E, that condition that initiates a train of events. So some of those direct causes, so multi-organ failure, some of those, they need to have the relevance of them to death understood. So it can be expected that when somebody's going to die, that their organs are going to fail. So the importance of that may not be so relevant for statistical output. However, something like a traumatic subdural hemorrhage could be really important. So really considering what's being pulled out is key to these. And then when we think about the contributing conditions, they can manifest in a number of ways as well. So it could be other chronic conditions where people are living with multiple comorbidities, and these are all interplaying together. Sometimes the mental health conditions can interplay with chronic health conditions. Sometimes they can interplay with how somebody accesses the health system, and sometimes they can have a real connection to that intent of death for the external causes. And we've also done some pilot work which is looking at lifestyle factors that can also contribute to poor health for external causes, and some of those can be considered in that multiple cause context as well. So really getting a good idea of what you're pulling out and how you're going to represent it is the first step in really identifying multiple cause constructs. And then we can analyse them by mentions or counts. And at the moment, this is really where we've been limited in the multiple cause space. So a mention is when we're looking at how many occurrences there are for a disease. So this certificate shows that this person's had a cardiac arrest, they've got hypertension and they've got obesity. So if we were interested in how many conditions there were for the circulatory chapter, we would say that there's 2 mentions. However, there is real risk with this method of overcounting people because it's still just 1 death. So you have to be really careful about that, although it does have some benefit with understanding the incidence of number of conditions for health service planning for mortality. The other way, and this is how the ABS currently outputs most of its multiple cause death data, is by counts. So even though we're still interested in circulatory conditions, we're still saying it's 1 count for a circulatory condition death, but we would also say it's 1 obesity related death as well. So once again, you've got to be careful not to double count people as you're adding them up, but you can individually identify them for diseases. So currently we are using multiple cause data very well for external causes of death. So for poisonings especially, the majority of the output is already analysed by multiple cause. So we're really going in for those drug toxicities and specified types of drugs that are very important for public health purposes. And for suicides, we have quite a few outputs now, which are just standard, which really are looking at the interplay between some of those contributing conditions and the mechanism and the intent of death. However, there are multiple opportunities for multiple cause data, and there's big gaps in the way that they're being analysed currently. So we're not really considering clusters and comorbid conditions for natural diseases in a sophisticated way, and this is a real opportunity for people who are interested in this. Also understanding that interrelatedness between direct, immediate and those other conditions, is that some premature thinking, but there's opportunity in that space, and considering the role of the coding and those ICD processes, how we're selecting that underlying cause. And I just put a little graph there to show that there's definitely some codes that are going to be the underlying cause compared to others. So cancers would nearly always be an underlying cause, whereas diabetes and hypertension and mood disorders, if you were interested in those, you would miss them if you were just looking at that single cause. And then there's things like dementia where it's even. So there's definitely gaps, but there are also future opportunities where we're moving to in this space. So I'll just go back to James to talk about that.
Okay, thank you, Laura. So I guess just coming back to the way in which we actually collect data, because this is really very relevant to how data will be analysed and used into the future, and also how we might make better use of the breadth of information collected. One of the most significant changes that will come in the next few years is the introduction of ICD-11, the next revision of the ICD, which has now actually been adopted by the World Health Assembly for use from 2022 onwards. And I guess why is that so important? Well, ICD-11 is an electronic classification. It brings the classification into the 21st century. And of course, that will have real benefits from the way it will integrate with smart analysis and coding techniques, perhaps with things like electronic health records. But it also introduces some new coding constructs. These are absolutely critical. So ICD-11 has 2 structures, stem codes and extension codes. Stem codes look very much like ICD-10. So you have a single tabular list organized into chapters that covers all of the diseases and conditions. It, of course, is updated from ICD-10 from a medical and scientific perspective. But then there is an entire set of extension codes that go with that stem code structure, and they allow us to capture additional information to go with any particular stem code. And the breadth of information that could be captured in extension codes is kind of unlimited. But to just give some examples, ICD-11 has a complete drug classification sitting behind it. Of course, that's one of the limitations of ICD-10, that mostly focuses on classes of drugs. but with a complete drug classification, that would give a much richer data source in that policy relevant area. But also things like location, and into the future, more and more things like genotype or phenotype. And as Lauren mentioned, things like risk factors. So all of these could be appended to STEM codes to further define what we know about a particular disease or condition. There's also a concept introduced in ICD-11 of clustering. This allows groups of codes to be linked together. They might be STEM codes with extension codes, they might be multiple STEM codes, but what we are saying now is that there are a group of things together that are more meaningful than if they were captured alone. One of the examples that is probably more developed in terms of how that will be used is in patient safety information, but there are other ways that that can be used that I think we're still yet to actually understand completely, and the international community is very much focusing on in the lead up to ICD-11 adoption. I might just give a quick view of what this is what the classification looks like. You can see this on the WHO's ICD-11 web browser. But on the left-hand side of the screen there, you can see a traditional tabular list, much like ICD-10. This is focusing on the self-harm deaths associated with opioid drugs. And in the center of the screen, you can see that there are additional post-coordination or extension codes that could be added to say whether the person intended to die, to give the place of occurrence where the person died, and also there you can see the drug list, which could be capturing one or more drugs that the person had in their system at the time of death. So mortality data will end up being part of a more integrated health information system, but it will always retain its piece of the puzzle in terms of giving either a doctor or coroner's view of what caused a death. And I think that's one of the things that will always make an underlying cause really important from a public health perspective. There are lots of ways that we can improve data, and just some of those ways include improvements to the foundations of individual data sets. We're looking specifically at place of death right now for causes of death, which seems to be very important from a palliative care perspective. We can have enhanced coding and capture of information. We've talked a lot about that, but suicide and drug deaths being good examples. Certainly we can work with stakeholders to try and improve the documentation that underpins the data. So what is provided on a medical certificate of cause of death is critically important, as is the consistency and availability of information through the coronial system. And of course, and very importantly, we should be working with academic and international partners to look at techniques to make better use of that rich multiple cause data where it is not currently being used so well. So just to come back to the original question, do we die of only one cause? Well, no, we don't die of only one cause. It is important to think about what the most important cause is. Most deaths do have multiple causes, and some highlight those concurrent morbidities. Some are simply showing that chain of events leading to death. So underlying cause will remain a valid technique, not just for us here in Australia, but the World Health Organization as they put together international mortality data. But definitely as the occurrence of comorbidities increases, there is a concern that the selection of underlying cause becomes more arbitrary in many cases. So while we do use multiple cause data, there is no doubt that we could find ways to better use that multiple cause data in a wide range of circumstances, and that could certainly enhance the public health value of this important data set into the future. So I might leave it there, and I'll hand over to Margarita for the second part of the presentation.
Thank you, James. I'll start sharing my screen. And my video. All right. So yes, thank you. This is the second part of the seminar. And so the idea is to talk about the methods that we could use for statistical modeling of multiple cause mortality using this death certificate data that Lauren and James have just described. So when they mentioned that there was need for more methods to see how we analyze this data. And when I think of that, I think of, well, first we need to think about what questions we might want to answer. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what are some common approaches and their caveats. And then talk about some methodological developments that I worked on already a couple of years ago, and their evaluation, and then move on to an example of their application, and then some concluding remarks. Just before I start, I wanted to acknowledge my collaborators in this work, which I started when I was back in France, at the equivalent of the ABS over there. So Gregore in particular, and also Big Biostat, which supported me to continue this work when I got here, and my current funding, which is this ARC-DECRA, and the Statistical Society for inviting me to this. And also before I jump in, I just wanted to note that all this work is published in 2 papers, in particular the first one in epidemiology in 2017, and also there is an R package available in my GitHub webpage, so which you can use to apply the methods. All right, so let's start with the question. So I'm going to focus on the setting where, in a research setting or even other types of settings, where you're interested in studying disease-related mortality. So a first question might be, we want to quantify the burden on mortality of each disease. So like James and Lauren showed, the graphs that showed the trends in mortality, that might be your goal. So that's the first question. And then a second type of question might be more in an epidemiological setting, where you're looking at the association between some characteristic, for example, lifestyle or genetics or something like that, and the force of mortality that is driven by each type of disease. So we're gonna distinguish these 2 types of questions, because as usual, different types of questions usually call for different methods. And so we want to see how to do that in the context of multiple cause mortality. We already have lots of methods to do that without by ignoring multiple cause mortality, but how could we do this with multiple cause mortality data? So we need the data that Lauren and James have described, and we also need a way to incorporate that data into our analytic methods. So this slide is just a quick overview of what James and Lauren described in more detail. So this is a mock-up of the standard form of the death certificate internationally, where we have 2 parts. In the first part is the primary morbid process that led up to death. It's simplified in the sense that I put that the underlying cause is the first thing that is showed, but as Lauren and James showed, that's not necessarily the case. But we can think about it in this term. So the initiating cause or the underlying cause is put at the end. And then as we move up, we have some intermediate causes, and then we have the immediate cause. That's part 1. And then in part 2, we have the other diseases that contributed to the death. So as they have explained, there are international rules that exist for coding all these causes and for selecting the underlying cause. And all the other codes are stored in national databases in France, in Australia, in the US. So that's the data that we have to answer these questions. And with regards to analytic methods, so let's think about the 2 questions that I mentioned. For the first type of question that's looking at the burden of mortality, so if you were wanting to monitor the trends from a public health perspective, then it's what we often use, even in the context of multiple cause mortality data, are, for example, standardized mortality rates, as we saw some of that in Lauren's presentation. For the second type of question, one might use some regression methods in the context of survival analysis, which are such as Cox regression models. And together, the Cox regression and standardized mortality rates, they are both part of a bigger range of methods called survival analysis methods, which actually have an underlying multi-state model that is looking at how events occur over time. So the common thing of standardized mortality rates, the Cox regression, it's all about rates and risk of events happening over time that we're observing over time. So time is the key thing that we need to think about. So in the context of multiple cause mortality, well, in the context that we are saying that maybe we don't die of only one cause, as James concluded, two common approaches are, well, first to ignore that we die of more than one cause. So just assume that each test has one cause and use the underlying cause that is selected using the WHO rules. And so the multi-state model that is underlying that approach looks like in this picture that I have here. So there's three states. The first is the state where you're alive. And then we're interested in looking at the rates, which are denoted here by lambda tilde, lambda 1 tilde, lambda 0 tilde. The rate at which deaths from the disease of interest are happening. So maybe you're interested in death from cardiovascular disease. So if someone dies from cardiovascular disease, according to the underlying cause construct, then we assume that they go into this first box, blue box. And if they die from other causes, we assume that they go into the second box. And so standardized mortality rates by disease are actually an estimate that is a summary estimate of that rate at which individuals are moving into the state 1. And rate from other causes would be a summary of that rate, instantaneous rate, which actually varies over time, and which individuals go into state 0. So that's one approach, to just ignore multiple causes. Another approach that's used, and Lauren mentioned it, is to consider any mention of the disease on the certificate as a separate event. Or maybe the same disease group, as Lauren said. She mentioned two different possibilities, but both of these end up in possibly counting each death many times. So if you have 7 causes that are mentioned or 7 causes of death groups, then you count 7 deaths. So that's not, those two approaches have these caveats that they don't acknowledge, they don't use the multiple cause of death data, or at least the first approach doesn't use the multiple cause data. The any mention approach counts each death many times, and none of the approaches really incorporate any information on the relative importance of each disease in the occurrence of death compared to the other causes that are there. So the aim of the work of the method that I'm going to present was to develop a model for multiple cause mortality that did not have this caveat. So that used all the causes, counted each death only once, and as far as possible, reflected the importance of each disease or each cause mentioned in the occurrence of death compared to the other causes that are mentioned on the certificate. So now I'll move on to explain what the method. So the central idea behind the method is to use a weighting approach. So by weighting approach, that can mean anything, but what I mean by that is that we're gonna assign a weight to each disease or each cause that is mentioned on the certificate, such that the sum of the weights is 1. So I have an example here where we have the underlying cause would possibly be the chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, and the immediate cause would be pneumonia. And then we have in part 2 of the certificate a mention of diabetes as a contributing cause. Assuming that that's all good, then we might give a larger weight of 0.8 to the COPD underlying cause, and then smaller weights to the other causes on the certificate, such that they add up to 1. And so what this means analytically is that when we're analyzing for example, the rate of death by chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, instead of looking at a cause of death indicator, so each death saying, did they die of COPD? Yes, no, we're gonna say, did this death die of any proportion of COPD, and what is that proportion? So in this case, we would say this death was 80% due to COPD, for example. So it's no longer a binary yes, no, now it's a proportion. And what this means is that we end up with a multi-state model that is like an extension of the model that I showed before, the single cause approach model, which has one state for each possible value of that proportion of attribution of disease to the death. So for a given disease that you're interested in, COPD, for example, then you have the alive state again, but now you have an infinite number of states that, for example, state pi says that the death is where deaths where a weight pi was attributed to that disease go. So in the previous example here where we had 80% for COPD, then the multi-state, in this multi-state model for COPD, that specific certificate would go into the 80% box, basically. And so this multi-state model conceptualizes mortality as being the result of a mixture of disease processes. This means that, as we see, if we model things this way, all contributing diseases on the certificate are represented. Each death will be counted just once because each one will go to just one of the boxes, because we do this for each possible disease. So we have a multi-state model for each possible disease. So each death is counted once every time across all the diseases. And then the relative importance of the disease can be reflected in the weights that we are giving, ideally. So this model kind of goes around those three caveats that we have talked about. And we're gonna look at these rates which show the rates at which events are going into each of the states in order to answer the questions. So I'm gonna talk about that in a minute, but first I wanted to talk about where these weights come from, like how do you decide if you put 0.8 or 0.2? So this notion is convenient. This notion of a weight that add up to 1 is a convenient choice because it allows us to do these three things that I said: count the multiple causes, count each death only once, and reflect the contribution of each disease. But it is only an approximation of the way diseases cause mortality. Firstly, because when we're talking about multiple cause data, we actually don't have prospective data that is following individuals over time and looking at the diseases that start arising and how those diseases are leading to death. So whenever we're looking at death certificate data, we are only looking at an approximation because we lose that temporal approach, but it has other benefits, which are that when you're looking at the death, at the causes that the medical expert has put on the certificate as the cause of death, then you could think that the causation behind that is stronger than when you're looking at prospective data. Anyway, so there's a whole discussion around that. But another aspect is that when we look at these weights that add up to 1 is that we're not really considering interactions between the diseases, but we're just acknowledging that many diseases were present. And in particular, the choice of the weights is subjective in the same way that it is to say that the underlying cause is this one or that one. That's also subjective. It depends on what your aim is, as Lauren showed. So we view the choice of the weights as a sensitivity analysis, and we propose various pragmatic approaches to get strategies, pragmatic strategies to assign these weights based on the available information. So here's an example of some of those strategies. the first strategy is to only to just consider. So if the disease that you're interested in is not mentioned, then the weight is 0. That's easy. But then if it is mentioned, then we can, for example, attribute the same weight to all the diseases in the certificate. So if, for example, there are K causes mentioned, then we assign each disease 1 over K, a weight of 1 over K. If we might actually want to distinguish between the underlying cause and the other causes, because we think the underlying cause construct is relevant. So we might assign a larger weight, omega, to the disease of interest if it's the underlying cause, or and then share out the remaining weight between all the other causes that are mentioned. And so that's what we did in the example before. There was a 0.8 for the COPD and then 0.1 for the other two approaches, so it adds up to 1. And then the third strategy, which is strategy C, could also consider the position of the disease on the certificate. So I think Lauren mentioned in the first part, there are some maybe the diseases that follow from the initiating cause. Sometimes multi-organ failure, for example, might not be as relevant. So we might assign a 0 weight to those and only keep the underlying cause from part 1, and then assign equal weights to the disease, to the rest of the weight in equal ways to the causes that are mentioned in part 2. So those are 3 strategies. And obviously the omega, like the weight that you choose here, you can also vary that in a sensitivity analysis. So moving on from that, let's assume we've assigned the weights to the death certificates using one of these strategies. Also, an important point is that obviously the single cause approach, where we ignore multiple causes, is equivalent to this strategy where we choose omega to be 1. So it kind of it's a particular case. The single cause approach is a particular case of the approach that can always be obviously considered as well. So moving on to how we address the questions with this multi-state model and the weights. So the first question was looking at how we would quantify the burden on mortality of each disease in the context of multiple causes. Well, a simple way of getting a mortality rate, assuming a constant hazard across time, which is what mortality rates always assume, is to sum the weights attributed to the disease of interest. So if you're looking at the rate of COPD, then you sum all the weights across your data set for all for COPD, and so this can be expressed as in this equation. And you can also derive age and sex standardized versions. And the nice thing here is that if you add up all the disease-specific rates, well, they add up to the total of all-cause mortality rates because you're not counting people more than once. For question 2, which is quantifying the association between an individual characteristic and the force of mortality driven by your disease of interest in the context of multiple cause mortality, then what we can look at is regression analysis of the hazard of what I call the pure hazard, which is the hazard of events going into that first state, which is when the death is 100% attributable to the disease, which arguably represents the force of mortality of that disease. But we can draw information from all the deaths that are partially attributed to the disease that you're interested in, so let's say it's COPD, by making an assumption like the one that I have here. So this assumption says that the rate of deaths going into a mixture state is going to be a weighted sum of the rates going into the 2 pure states. So it's the state where the disease was 100% attributable to the disease and 0% attributable to the disease. And so using that sort of thinking, we can posit Cox regression models for each of the states. So we have a Cox regression model for the first state, a Cox regression model for the 0 state, and then using the assumption that I just mentioned, we have an implied regression model for the mixture states. And the question that we're asking is, what is the association between a given factor X on the rate of mortality from COPD? So our target parameter is that regression coefficient here, rho. But we're going to estimate it simultaneously while fitting all these models. So we incorporate all the data and all those partially attributed deaths into our estimation. We developed some estimation equation methodology to do this, details in the paper. And we also evaluated the approach in a simulation study, also more details in the paper. And this led to a more refined approach to answer question 1, which is looking at a time-dependent cumulative version of that mortality rate that can be derived from those Cox models. So just to illustrate briefly, and then I'll wrap up. We have an example that's estimating educational inequalities in disease-related mortality using a sample of French men aged more than 30, followed up for, sorry, did something. Followed up for 8 years, and at the end of which 12% had died, and we were looking just at quantifying an inequality index, so there's association between education and mortality. And so our findings, here's just an example of our findings, looking at all the approaches, the any mention approach, the single cause approach, and all the multiple cause approaches, show that maybe the socioeconomic inequalities in digestive disease related mortality might have been underestimated by these other approaches. And also we applied that cumulative baseline hazard, and we saw that the disease ranking by age group varied. So just to conclude, we have the first, we proposed the first formal statistical model for multiple cause mortality that enables to use this very valuable data produced by the IBS to answer these key questions in public health. But many challenges remain. As I mentioned, it's only an approximation of the causal process. There is no easy solution to this weight estimation issue. There's some issues with causal interpretation if the question is causal, and there are other types of questions that might be of interest regarding mixture states, clustering of diseases that are not covered in this model. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Sabine to handle the questions.
Hello.
Yes, hi, hello. It's Sabine again. Thank you both, James, Moran, and Margarita, for these wonderful presentations. I found them very insightful for me, not being familiar with the topic myself. We received a question for James and Lauren, and also a question for Margarita, which we hopefully can look into in the last 5 minutes of the webinar. So maybe first a question for James and Lauren. I think maybe this one is one for James. So we received a question that how does the data collection and the coding vary between countries? And I think the question stemmed from the fact that ICD-11 is proposing to collect some additional data, which looked very advanced. So it might be challenging in some of the low research countries.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it was one that was probably at the heart of a lot of discussions within the task force trying to finalise the 11th revision. And the truth of the matter is that the world's information gathering capabilities move very quickly. And I think ICD-11 has very much got the capability to telescope, if you like, from a very simple version of a classification to one that looks very much like ICD-10, to one that actually then could collect far more information if required. So for countries that have very rich health information, and of course we're very lucky to have a national coronial system and ability to gather all that additional data, the classification offers a mechanism to capture all of that. For countries that don't have that yet, they will get there eventually. And as they use ICD-11 to, not to its full potential in the first place, it will still be fit for purpose. But in the future, I think it will remain fit for purpose for much longer than other classifications because of that capability.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks, James. Yeah, and we received 2 questions or more questions even coming in from Margarita. So the first question we received for Margarita was that the data we have, someone posted that the data that they have doesn't distinguish between part 1 and 2. And they wonder whether it's correct to assume that strategy C can't be done.
Yes, I think so, yeah, because the strategy C was looking at trying to distinguish different causal processes. So it's under the assumption that the part 1 is a specific process, and then all the diseases in part 2 are other different processes. So yes, I think you would have to use a simpler strategy like the equal weight or strategy B.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to the questions which were now sent to everyone. So I think hopefully everyone can see the questions. So one of the questions was received by Mitilesh on how do you do recurrent events multiple cause survival analysis?
Yes, good question. So as you see, there's many, even in this simple non-recurrent event type of, I guess you would first need to ask what your recurrent events are. Surely it's not death, because that's, once you die, that's the end. So it has to be recurrent events that are before death. And so I'm sure that usual problem is looked at in multi-state models that have multiple states over time. And so I guess you could extend this method by allowing for those rates into other states over time, and then at the end have the same extension. So usually when you ignore multiple causes, you would have at the end death from the disease of interest, death from other causes, like in a kind of competing risks situation. And you could definitely think about that just expanding into those infinite states that we had in our model. So this approach could be incorporated in that way. I think, but I have not actually done it.
Yeah, thanks. And someone was wondering whether there is some temporal information on the death certificates that could be used.
I did see, for example, it was good to see the example for the ABS. There is, I think, some temporal information that is put in there from the doctors about how long each condition was present. But for the moment, like when we developed this approach, we didn't even think that the quality of the data, of that sort of detail of data from medical certificates was enough to be able to do something very refined statistically for that. But that's certainly something interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, and so the model that you applied is a regression model. So there's clearly a Bayesian around in our audience at the moment. So I was wondering whether there are any Bayesian networks, for example, that could be used to answer some of your questions.
Bayesian networks. So what is it like that? Well, the question is, I guess, whether you would need a Bayesian network, like a survival Bayesian network, I guess, and then look at the extension, like develop an extension that's similar to this. But whether it's Bayesian or frequencies, I guess the key thing is to think about what your models mean and how they're incorporating the data and how they answer the questions that you're interested in.
Yeah, thank you. We are running out of time. It's 2:00, so I will close the webinar. There is one question left from Ian Gordon, but maybe you can discuss it among yourselves. Ian Gordon is close by in Melbourne, so I will forward a question to you, Margarita, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'm closing the webinar now. So thank you all for attending the webinar. So the webinar has been recorded and will be made available. The next webinar of the Statistical Society of Australia will be on Friday, the 21st of February, on the topic of statistical machine learning for spatial temporal forecasting. So that's closing now of this webinar, and thank you all very much for attending. I hope you found it very interesting, and hope you also are interested to join any of the future webinars of the Society. Thank you all.